morning and welcome to yet another session of the NPTEL course Postmodernism in Literature. Today's lecture is titled Minor Literature and Postmodern Narratives, and this is also in continuation with our discussion of Deleuze and Guattari which we started undertaking in the previous session. Postmodern narratives challenge the idea, the conventional idea of narratives. It also encourages us to think beyond the common sense definitions and the traditional notions which are attributed to narratives and techniques and characteristics of narratives. And consequently, with the postmodern turn, which is also a post-structuralist turn, there are certain narrative consequences that we engage with, we deal with when we engage with particular kinds of texts and narratives. Such as there is no idea of a single author, meaning or a text. We have moved away from all of those definitive limiting concepts, and also it has radically challenged our views of what a text is and what the author means, and this is something that we have already taken a look at right from the beginning of our discussions related to postmodernism. And more importantly, we are also encouraged to distrust the authorial voice, to move away from the certainty of the text, which hitherto was understood to be as a site which offered closed definitive meanings. On the contrary, with this moving away from the authorial voice, with this moving away from the certainty of a text, what we have before us is the text as a site of multiple pluralities. So these are also some of the things that we have been discussing continuously throughout a range of discourses, a range of critical frameworks within the gamut of postmodernism. In addition, we also dealt with the fact that contrary to the conventional traditional expectations of a narrative, some of the elements which were set to distort the meaning making process of the narratives they have now come to be at the forefront of the narrative process, such as fragmentation, the ideas of freedom, simulation, contamination, and difference with an A, textuality and intertextuality, concepts such as rhizomes, the move towards an anti-totality process rather than a coherent process of unity. So we have begun to notice that these are some of the elements which now dominate the narratives of particularly the postmodern writers of the contemporaries, such as Umberto Eco, John Barr, Thomas Pynchon, Milan Kundera, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Delilo, Rushdie, Grahamsworth, Martin Amis, to name a few. So while we deal with these consequences, the postmodern narrative consequences, it is also important to take a look at certain particular shifts that happened in this process, and with relation to theories, frameworks and new concepts which are being introduced. So in continuation with the discussion on Deleuze and Guattari, here we also introduce a theory of minor literature in this context, and this theory of minor literature was put forward by Deleuze and Guattari in one of their books published in 1975, titled Kafka Toward a Minor Literature. The title being very self-explanatory, it is certainly about Kafka and about how they developed a theory of minor literature using the works of Kafka. This in that sense posits a new approach towards Kafka's works, and they also in continuation with most of their other works which rely on psychoanalysis and also on various aspects of politics, they also engage with discussions of subversion and politically significant literature. And by engaging with Kafka and by positing Kafka's work as minor literature, what they are doing is a process through which they begin to contrast a particular kind of writing against major literatures. And what they refer to as major literatures are the literatures which have been part of literary canon, the literatures which have been written by supposedly great literary masters. So in that sense, when he talks about minor literature, he is also talking about the possibility of a different kind of literature which exists outside the gamut of canon, outside the framework of dominant literary critical practices. These are some of the arguments that Deleuze and Guattari put forward when they talk about minor literature. First of all, great literature according to them, all great literature according to them would be minor literature. And here it is important to note that they do not use the term minor as a derogatory term, rather it is used as a term to talk about particular kinds of differences which are otherwise not being included, which are otherwise not being considered central as part of canon or as part of dominant critical practices. And why is all great literature considered minor? Because they argue its language would be foreign, open, unfinalizable, creative and mutating. And what do they mean by foreign? Foreign is needs to be understood as a contrasting term in connection with whatever that is not native and not familiar. So, here is a celebration of a move away from the native, away from the familiar, to talk about language, to talk about particular practices as being foreign, and by consequence they also become open rather than closed, unfinalizable rather than talking about certainties, talking about unities and coherences. And here they also refer to the process, because the process is about becoming and the event is more about a product. It also begins to make sense in multiple ways. This is about a process, this is about becoming rather than engaging with a final product. It is unfinalizable and it is also more creative rather than limited to particular kinds of representations and expressions. And it would not be wrong to say that when Deleuze and Guattari talk about minor literature, they are also celebrating a revolutionary way of writing, which they think Kafka exemplified. It also enables us to talk about literature, to talk about particular kinds of writings beyond the realm of classical works and traditional literary criticism. So, here the postmodern theories, they begin to very radically affect the ways in which critical establishment works, the ways in which critical practices have been employed. They also provide leeway into not just a different kind of writing, but also into a different kind of reading and a different kind of critical practice to be in place. In order to understand this in a better context, we also need to be a little more familiar with one of the other works by Deleuze and Guattari, 1000 Platos, which was published in 1980. So, here they draw our attention to the distinction between the majoritarian and minoritarian cultural practices. Though this work does not directly refer to minor literature, it becomes quite important in understanding what they mean by minor literature and how they begin to define majoritarian and minoritarian practices. 1000 Platos was one of the most influential works by Deleuze and Guattari, and it was written in a non-linear fashion. It was also considered as a major statement in the context of post-structuralism and postmodernism. As one of the commentators of Deleuze and Guattari would put it, majoritarian is an opposition based on already established terms where the distinction relies on one privileged or dominant term. So, the complexity of the definitions attributed to majoritarian and minoritarian could be further simplified using the example of man and woman. Man is used as a privileged term, and therefore, the opposition, the way in which the term woman is defined in opposition to man, it is also in terms of the majoritarian impulse which is attributed to the term man. Because there is man is by virtue of being defined in this context of being majoritarian or minoritarian, man automatically, the term man automatically assumes the position of a standard, the position of a norm, which does not exist for the term woman. So, in that sense, the term man becomes more expressive rather than creative. It becomes a norm, it becomes a standard in opposition to which the term woman needs to be talked about. And we cannot say woman can be again defined, because the definitions have already been set, the definitions have already been attributed to the term man, and the woman can be talked about, the woman can be referred to only in opposition to this majoritarian impulse. So, Deleuze and Guattari draw our attention to this fact that once a term becomes more expressive rather than creative, we see a majoritarian impulse operating in connection to that term. In the same way, if the term woman was considered more as a more in terms of a norm or in terms of a standard, we could also see the majoritarian impulse operating in association with the term woman. And this could be the same could be seen as being applicable to a number of other binary words such as black and white or good and bad. There is a way in which a privileged word is being associated with certain majoritarian impulses, and we also see the other binary term being defined in opposition to this privileged term. In that sense, it's also important to note that when we talk about a woman in this context as a linguistic aspect, as a concept which language talks about, there is only a possibility of becoming a woman and not defining, because the term has already been defined vis-a-vis the majoritarian impulse associated with the term man. And when we talk about minor literature and how Deleuze and Guattari have been theorizing minor literature with respect to the works of Kafka, it's also important to understand who Kafka is. Kafka lived from 1883 to 1924. He is also considered as one of the early modernist writers. Some of his famous works include The Metamorphosis, The Trial and The Castle, which are also succinct examples of realism and also about existentialism, which are exemplified in most of his works. And there is even a term associated with the writings of Kafka, Kafkaesque, because Kafka essentially did not imitate any kind of writing, but he in turn gave rise to a kind of writing which became a standard on its own. Kafka's life and the choices that he made in terms of his writing are particularly interesting because he was born in a German-speaking family while living in Prague. He was also of Jewish origin, which further complicated matters for him, and he also lived in a province where there existed hostile relationships between those who speak German and those who speak Czech. And though Kafka was familiar and well versed in both these languages, Czech and German, he considered German as his mother tongue and he wrote mostly in German. So his writing, his identity which emerged through writing was fraught within the conflicts which were part of culture, territory and the political issues of those times. So it is in this context that we find Deleuze and Guattari developing a theory of minor literature in connection with the writings of Kafka. So what prompts Deleuze and Guattari to look at Kafka's writings as minor literature? Because Kafka was a Czech and he was writing in a language that was not his own, German, and therefore he was operating in a realm without standards and definitions. Here we notice that language also becomes a tool through which yardsticks, standards and particular kinds of definitions and set opinions also emerge. And here, by moving away from certain kinds of expectations, by possessing particular kinds of identities and not choosing to write in a way that would reflect that kind of identity, Deleuze and Guattari argue Kafka becomes the author of minor literature. This is also because he displays a certain openness to change. He is embracing possibilities. He is engaging with the ideas of becoming rather than about fixed entities, fixed identities, and rather than rather than continuing to be stuck with certain rigid, compartmentalized, rigid, institutionalized ideas about language, about identity, and about the politics associated with it. So here, by extension, by using Kafka, Deleuze and Guattari are also leading us to believe that great literature emerges when one is open to change, when one embraces the possibilities of becoming rather than sticking to the definitions, the standards which have always already been there. And Kafka is a particularly interesting example to take in this case because he wrote without a sense of the people or any fixed identity. Instead, he wrote about a world, about a set of people who are yet to come, who were somewhere in the future, about a set of people who were in the process of defining themselves rather than a people who already had a kind of identity which they could own as their own. To quote, it would be useful to go through a very brief excerpt from Deleuze and Guattari's work where they talk about minor literature. A minor literature doesn't come from a minor language. It is rather that which a minority constructs within a major language. But the first characteristic of minor literature in any case is that in it, language is affected with a high coefficient of deterritorialization. In this sense, Kafka marks the empire that bars access to writing for the Jews of Prague and turns their literature into something impossible. The impossibility of not writing, the impossibility of writing in German, the impossibility of writing otherwise. The three characteristics of minor literature are the deterritorialization of language, the connection of the individual to a political immediacy, and the collective assemblage of enunciation. We might as well say that minor no longer designates specific literatures, but the revolutionary conditions for every literature within the heart of what is called great or established literature. Here it's important to draw our attention to certain very specific aspects that Deleuze and Guattari talk about. Minor needs to be understood in a context that is defamiliarized to us, in a context that defines the common sense conventional meanings that are attributed to the term minor. Here, minor does not refer to a minor language, and minor does not refer to a community which is hierarchically placed in a minority status. On the contrary, it is about a revolutionary kind of writing as they put forward, and it also has particular characteristics. The first one of deterritorialization of language, the connection of the individual to a certain political immediacy, and also the collective assemblage of enunciation. So, in Kafka's writing, we find all of the three elements coming together. And this is particularly noticeable as Deleuze and Guattari themselves talk about the impossibility of writing for the Jews in Prague, how Kafka turns a literature into something impossible. So, here he is actually using languages which are always already available and using the same set of language, the same kind of language and the existing system of politics into a possibility which would help him to produce something entirely new, entirely revolutionary. And there Deleuze and Guattari believe rests the possibility of new literatures emerging, great literature emerging, which are also minor in nature. So, this idea of minor, it is not a pejorative term, it is not used as a derogatory term. Instead, it emerges as a term for an icon of difference, of process and of becoming. So, we need to move away from the conventional, the traditional definitions which are attributed to minor, and as opposed to literatures and artists and writers being major, and on the contrary, we need to approach the term minor in a peculiar sense, because according to Deleuze and Guattari, the term also stands for freedom from oppressive norms and standard and freedom from fixed definitions. And this incidentally is the crux of postmodern writing, postmodern approaches. And when they talk about minor literature, they are also talking about a kind of literature which does not conform to role models or stereotypes, something which moves away from the set standards, something that moves away from the demands of dominant critical practices. It is also a kind of literature which rejects all kinds of definitions that exist as a commonplace and also open to difference. And this kind of literature, Deleuze and Guattari argue, and through the examples from Kafka, this kind of literature, they argue, it thrives on defiance and subversion and resists totality of any kind. And this incidentally is also some of the things that we had been talking about right from the beginning in connection with the discussions related to postmodernism. Postmodernism also, like minor literature, is a move away from any attempt to bring in a sense of totality, any attempt to bring in coherence, any conscious attempt to stick to a pattern, stick to particular kinds of definitions. On the contrary, it encourages a moving away from all kinds of patterns, all kinds of coherences, all sorts of systems which encourage the building of a unity. To quote Deleuze and Guattari again, this is the glory of this sort of minor literature, to be the revolutionary force for all literature. The utilization of English and of every language in Joyce, the utilization of French and English in Beckett. So, they also draw our attention to the fact that Kafka is not, and certainly not, the only example that we can use to talk about minor literature. We can also talk about Joyce, about Beckett, who are also other leading modernist figures of the early 20th century. And the key word here is again revolution. Any kind of literature which has the possibility of revolution, not just in terms of the content, but in terms of the language which is being used, in terms of the defiance that it displays against the existing dominant critical practices. It has the possibility, it has the potential to become minor literature. So, what are the implications of this kind of a reading? Deleuze and Guattari, it may be possible to say that they enable us to recognize Kafka's social position as a marginalized author, And incidentally, this happens through the medium of language that he uses, through a problematization of the language of his choice, which he uses for his creative expression. And because Kafka is identified here as a Czech Jew who wrote in German, which was not a very acceptable thing, which was not a very familiar thing either. And here, as Raymond Selden, a leading theorist, would put it, we are being introduced to Kafka as a non-conformist, innovatory and interrogative, as opposed to a majoritarian literature which aims to represent a given world and to match established models. So here some of the key words are very important. Majoritarian literature vis-a-vis minor literature, it aims to represent. But Kafka's literature or Beckett's or Joyce's literature, which can easily fall into the category of minor literature according to Deleuze and Guattari, they do not propose to represent particular identities. They do not propose to represent particular kinds of groups, particular kinds of social fabric, or particular kinds of concepts. On the contrary, they exist as non-conformist, innovative and interrogative. And they also try to be creative. They also try to move away from the existing identities rather than representing them. And for the same reason, when they use language in particular ways, that also becomes a revolutionary way through which they reject existing identities and existing forms of practices of writing. And here significantly, the use of language as a critical tool, as a demarcatory force that also happens in a very postmodernist way. And we've also seen how language plays a very significant role in the post-structuralist thinking, in the postmodernist thinking, how language has ceased to be a given, and how it also becomes a definite unique kind of a tool in the format of postmodern thinking. So here when Deleuze and Guattari talk about minor literature and how Kafka dissociates himself from certain kinds of identity by a particular kind of use of language, language in that sense over here is not associated with a body or person. On the contrary, it emerges as a collective and dispersed identity. And when it becomes associated with a person, they also remind us, when language becomes associated with a particular person, event or a context, it is re-territorialized. So what Kafka or Joyce or Beckett does with language is a kind of a deterritorialization. So when language is not associated with a body, with an identity, a particular person, a kind of deterritorialization happens. That is also a concept that Deleuze and Guattari discussed extensively in some of their works. And in the contrary, I repeat, when language is again associated with a person, a particular event or with a context, it is re-territorialized. So here the play of language, it is again a very typical thing in the postmodern period. This play of language becomes a determinant force, not just in identifying particular kinds of literature, but also it has the potential to identify how a literature becomes revolutionary, innovative, or how it moves away from the dominant critical practices. So in that context, minor literature also gets identified and defined as a kind of language and literature of groups that seek creativity rather than expression of any identity. So here creativity is demarcated as a very unique and distinct thing vis-a-vis expression or representation. And herein also lies the revolutionary potential inherent in minor literatures and the writings of Kafka, Joyce and Beckett. And here language also becomes a tool, a force through which one can also seek identity through the process of writing. And here in fact one needs to make a distinction between the identities which have always pre-existed and the identities, the new identities which need to be forged. Minor literatures occur in the context of certain kinds of identities which are not given, certain kind of identities which do not pre-exist. On the contrary, minor literatures exist in the context of communities, of identities that also have the need to forge a new identity, forge a new sense of community and a new sense of meaning, because they are also defying all kinds of constructs of the dominant societal, linguistic and ideological norms. And in that sense, language also here focuses on the aspect of becoming rather than merely expressing or representing. So, language also becomes a language of search, and this is also exemplified in the works of Toni Morrison and Alice Walker, because they could also be considered as writers of minor literature. This is also a parallel that one of the leading commentators of theory, Pramod Nair, draws extensively and builds upon it. And he talks about how Toni Morrison and Alice Walker, they refused to accept the identities that were readily available to them as blacks in America. But on the contrary, they move away from these readily available identities, these readily available subject positions, and they try to find new forms of expression that would invent new identities. For example, we know the kind of things that Toni Morrison and Alice Walker engaged with. They engaged with the identities of not just blacks, but also about identities which were part of women, about lesbians, about other marginalized communities and identities. So, in that sense, the language which minor literature uses, it becomes a language of becoming, the language of search, the language of inventing a language of becoming a new identity rather than expressing or representing a pre-existing and already existing identity or a position. So, when we talk about forging new identities, there are also other examples that come to our mind. For example, the Aboriginal writers in Australia and Canada, they also turn to certain oral traditions and storytelling formats in search of a form that can invent new identities rather than simply accept or represent the ready-made ones, because there is a need to look beyond the fixed categorizations, a need to look beyond access beyond the existing identities which are also part of certain cultural constructs, or also part of certain social hierarchical systems which have been inherent in the societies. So, it is important to see say categories such as a black, aboriginal or a woman as not as fixed identities, but as a process of becoming, as a series of negotiations with other identities rather than seeing them as a fixed unnegotiable categories. So, here we also draw a parallel with other discussions that we have been having about how postmodernism encourages a certain unfinalizability of meaning, how it is more open rather than closed, how it is open to the forging of new possibilities rather than to the fixation of limiting categories. And in that sense, we also, when we talk about minor literature, it is also about reiterating the fact that there is nothing proper, there is no standard identity, and nothing is pre-given. Everything is in the process of becoming, and even the moment you stop this process, the moment you put a break on this process of becoming, it also ceases to be open, it also ceases to engage with the possibility of forging new identities. So, to sum up, minor literature is any writing that refuses to provide a unified, a definitive identity. On the contrary, it focuses on escapes, on flows, on deterritorialization, on the processes of unfinalizability and becoming. And minor literature is also a kind of literature that studies differences, deviations, variations and possibilities rather than fixed, stable identities. And this, as Deleuze and Guattari would tell us, it could be it is exemplified in the works of Kafka, Joyce, Beckett and the likes. And minor literature is also a literature that seeks evolution rather than finished products. So, the focus on becoming rather than representation becomes all the more important. And it is also important to keep in mind that minor literature is not always about minorities, and it need not be, and it need not have to be by or about minorities. It is certainly minor, the term needs to be understood in a very different import, and that continues to be the crux of the theory of minor literature and how it connects with the postmodern narrative techniques. And also it is a move away from being conventional because it adopts other forms, it steals from multiple sources, it creates disruptive images. Again, Toni Morrison's example about how in her depiction of ghosts she refuses to attribute a type to them. And minor literature is also about moving away from the conventional easy binaries of say man, woman, human, animal, or even about concepts related to beauty, about good and evil. And this refusal is at the crux of the emergence of the possibility of minor literature. As and when we begin to wind up this lecture, it's also important to reiterate the connection between writer and text, which the postmodernist approach has repeatedly tried to disrupt. And Deleuze and Guattari are also inviting us to this process of subversion by paying close attention to language and to author. Herein we also note a lot of similarities with that of Barth's Death of the Author in terms of the theories and methods adopted by both Barth as well as Deleuze and Guattari. And Barth's text, just as Death of the Author or even Foucault's What is an Author, the way in which it helps us to understand the relation between writer and literature is further complicated, is further problematized by Deleuze and Guattari's engagement with minor literature and how the language plays a role in subverting particular kinds of identities and particular kinds of writings. And this is where we also look at the postmodern shift, which is inherent in this theory of minor literature, because it encourages us to see literature beyond what is said and to evaluate how things are said, and also to bend language to deprive of its familiarity, to move away consciously from the familiarity, from the trap of familiarity that language entails. And these choices, Deleuze and Guattari, just like Barth does, reminds us that it is also part of the choices which are to be considered by the writer, because the writer also has an inherent responsibility to move away from the familiar or to deterritorialize language in the way that Deleuze and Guattari talk about the ideas of minor literature. So, here we come to the end of today's session, where we also reiterate the need to talk about these existing dialogues across the postmodern writers, across the postmodern theories and frameworks, because they all lead us to the possibilities of innovative changes, to the possibilities of newer identities, to the possibilities of moving away from the fixed, from the constructed identities and from the constructed forms of reading a text. So, with this, we wind up today's session. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.